Hello again, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us once again for Sunday's edition of Alaska Weather. I'm Dave Percy, a meteorologist with the National Weather Service. First graphic today is fire danger, showing high fire danger over the upper Yukon Valley, kind of a reemergence to some extent there, upper Yukon Valley in the flats. Otherwise, out west, Seward Peninsula and any western areas there have no fire danger. It's been all the rain they've received there with the front coming in across the Bering Strait, St. Lawrence Island, bringing significant amounts of rain. In the case of Nome, almost an inch in the last 24 hours, and anywhere from a third to maybe half an inch in other locations. So that put an end to fire danger in those areas. North Slope there, warm and dry and breezy, so we've got a wide increased area of high to very high fire danger there. And in the case of the Copper River Basin, that's mostly due to the gusty winds they had today along the Copper River and in the valley there, up to 35 miles an hour, for example, at Gulkana today. And that's really popped in there as a result from the wind, more as a result from the wind rather than any hot, dry conditions. And hazardous weather graphic. Wind advisory for the eastern Alaska Range, west of the Tok Cutoff, through the passes mainly, gusts 50 miles an hour. And that's still occurring here at last hour. Delta Junction having gusts to around 50 miles an hour. Slowly diminishing though, and is expected to end early this evening as the winds continue to drop off. And from there, no other watches, warnings, or advisories are out anywhere around the state. Satellite imagery shows front that came across the Bering Strait, northern Bering Sea there, moving onshore, and really slow moving. The main upper low and low center back over the Russian Far East, barely moving, just drifting eastward. And so that's laid down some good rainfall due to the slow movement of the front, and that spreading rain down into the southwest interior, where about 1 to 2 tenths fell during the day today, and south central Alaska picking up 1 to 2 tenths of an inch of rain also. But in the interior there were some breaks early on in Fairbanks, and the thicker, higher cirrus rolled in there. And the southeast coast had partly mostly sunny skies down over the southern panhandle, and some sunshine even in the north, but the clouds increased in the northern areas today, and that sort of capped the temperatures off mostly in the 60s, while southern southeast coast had temperatures approaching, well, upper 60s to size the mid 70s, and also up over the northeast interior. Fort Yukon had 75. Otherwise, it is pretty chilly back to the west with afternoon temperatures in the 40s and 50s. And for the chart today, you can see a couple of low centers there to the southwest. That's where the precipitation starts, and pretty widespread area of precipitation again, and of course clouds, that with the heaviest occurring over the west coast areas, or western Alaska, down in toward Kodiak Island. Another trough brought some moisture up into the North Gulf Coast today, as well as south central Alaska, a few tenths of an inch falling. And that trying to push on to the north coast of the Panhandle. Again, that's the increase in the clouds this afternoon, partly mostly sunny skies down to the south. Out over the Aleutians, westerly flow. There were on the lee side of the islands breaks and clearing, as well as the Alaska Peninsula. Conditions were dry, low clouds and fog over the Bering Sea though, and a couple of troughs producing some light rain, fog, and drizzle, mostly north of the Pribilos, but that's sliding into Nunivak Island and the Yukon Delta coast. Otherwise, some sunshine today for St. Lawrence Island and also the eastern Arctic coast. Forecast for tonight, low pressure in that front slowly pushing eastward. But now a new center forming there just west of Kotzebue Sound, the original center weakening over the Russian Far East. So we have a band of rain from the northwest coast, extending all the way down into Togiak Bay, passing the Pribilofs, but staying north of the Alaska Peninsula. Look for clearing Kodiak Island and diminishing showers south central Alaska, but those showers will stay more widespread over the upper Tanana Valley and actually pushing up into the upper Yukon Valley. And look for rain, periods of light rain, fog, and drizzle that's showing up on the north coast now to spread across all of the Panhandle by Monday morning. Otherwise, for Monday, the rain, whatever that moves in, will become more showery in the afternoon and tend to end, especially up to the north and over toward Yakutat. North Gulf Coast could see some sunshine. Another cloudy, cool, wet day basically for much of interior Alaska with minimal thunderstorm activity, fog and low clouds, Bering Sea. Gale force winds, rain, move into the far western Aleutians, and that system moves north of Shimia in the afternoon on Tuesday. The front pushes to just west of Adak, and look for a possible narrow band of gales persisting just in advance of that front, along with the rain and fog. High pressure clears it out over the southwest interior, risk of thunderstorms, eastern Alaska range to the Wrangels. And for the lows tonight, 30s for the Arctic coast, otherwise 40s and 50s over the remainder of interior Alaska. And highs tomorrow, really struggling to push 70, although you may see 70, 71 again on the upper Yukon Valley. Otherwise, that's about it. 50s and 60s sum it up. 40s along the Arctic coast, out over the Bering Sea and the Aleutians, with much cooler tomorrow for the Panhandle. We'll see in the 50s. And for the lows the following morning, Tuesday morning, we've got mid to upper 30s along the Arctic coast, lower 40s in the northern interior, but near 50 for the upper Yukon Valley. Otherwise, 40s to maybe lower 50s covers it well. And highs, again, maybe a tad warmer in the Susitna Valley, otherwise about the same for the remainder of the state. 50s, lower 60s southeast coast, 50s along the west coast, and upper 40s in the Aleutians.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
First line weather graphic for Monday morning showing IFR central eastern Beaufort Sea coast and a swath there from the northwest coast on down across the western interior into Bristol Bay, and then covering just about all of the Bering Sea and the Aleutians right up to St. Lawrence Island, but a patch of VFR off the Yukon Delta coast and Nunavut Island. Otherwise, IFR across southern Alaska, marginal VFR in the eastern interior, and IFR for most of the southeast coast. And for the afternoon, IFR now restricted to just about all the offshore areas of the Gulf of Alaska and southward. Marginal VFR now retreating back to the coast of the Panhandle and still inland across Prince William Sound and into the southern Copper River Basin, Wrangell Mountains. Another zone up across the Talkeetnas to the central Alaska Range, coming back down along the western Alaska Range and the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, and some VFR breaking out over the southwest interior, as well as along the Yukon River. And then the central interior, marginal IFR, most of the Arctic coast, Bering Sea, St. Lawrence Island, on down across the entire Aleutian chain, IFR. Right on the edge there for Dutch Harbor, marginal VFR from there eastward up the Alaska Peninsula. Tuesday morning, IFR right on up to the central Alaska Range, the western Alaska Range, to possibly Lake Clark Pass. And for the Talkeetna Mountains and the central Alaska Range, looks like starting out IFR, extending back into Prince William Sound, North Gulf Coast IFR, and then we've got Northern Panhandle, Lynn Canal Glacier Bay VFR, and just to the south there, IFR, and then southern half of the Panhandle, mostly marginal except for the coast. And Alaska Peninsula, Bering Sea side, IFR, otherwise marginal, and no change over the Bering, still just widespread IFR, including the Aleutians. That extends up along all the Arctic coast, eastern North Slope, into the northern Kobuk and Koyukuk valleys. Then for Tuesday afternoon, we've got IFR again, right along the Arctic coast, pulling back, and improvement over the North Slope and Brooks Range. And not too bad there along the Yukon River and even the Kuskokwim River in the valley until you get out to the deltas, and then you're into the marginal VFR zone that extends up across the Seward Peninsula and from, say, Kivalina all the way around to Point Lay. And then IFR, a little less, but still a big chunk out there over the Bering Sea, just off the southwest coast, down across the Pribilofs, and roughly Adak and Atka on out to the west. and VFR, Kodiak Island, Kenai Peninsula, Cook Inlet, and mostly marginal with patchy areas IFR for the southeast coast. And for passes, Anatuvik, IFR, improving to marginal VFR, and the Monday forecast for Adigan, just the same, starting out with the lowest conditions in the morning, becoming better in the afternoon, like Clark and Merrill. Same trend, IFR to start, marginal VFR to finish, and rainy, IFR becoming marginal, windy. Same trend and forecast, IFR trending toward marginal VFR, and Isabel IFR becoming marginal. And Montesta, a little bit better over there, starting out marginal and then VFR through late morning into the afternoon. Tanita, IFR becoming VFR, optimistically. And for Portage, pretty good chance of becoming VFR in the afternoon due to westerly wind flow there. May take a little longer in the western entrance, but looking pretty good in the latter part of the afternoon. And for Chilkoot and White, looks like another VFR day coming up. And for freezing levels, cool air aloft, southern Alaska, 4,000 feet there, and then 8,000 feet up over the eastern Brooks Range and Arctic coast, and then chillier air now shifting eastward along the Yukon Delta coast back across St. Lawrence Island, looking at 2,000 to 4,000 feet there. Much warmer over the central western Aleutians, where it's 10,000 to 12,000 feet. And for icing, warmer air coming along with some icing, but that's going to be above that 10,000 to 12,000 foot level, increasing icing far western Aleutians. Otherwise, the interior, a lot of moisture. Could be a couple areas of considerable moderate rime icing from the western Alaska Range across the northern Kuskokwim Valley there up toward southern Kobuk Valley. Otherwise, just scattered areas most everywhere else, especially the Panhandle, could see has a potential for some isolated moderate rime icing, but doesn't look too significant. And jet stream, upper level low, Russian Far East continues. Jet stream mostly south of the forecast area. 40 to 45 knots southwest winds here coming into Bristol Bay up into the central interior. About the same pattern, 3,000 feet, but lighter and turbulence. Western Aleutians looks a little choppy.
Some places on the surface you might have these steep cracks and giant fissures that you would have to be careful not to fall into. In other places you might see towers of ice right next to places that were relatively smooth. You might see places that were dark. Ice there takes the form of rock. It's frozen solid until you dig down into that ocean. So you may see some things that look similar to Earth, but you may see some things that are very different.
That voice you just heard?
I am Morgan Kramer, NASA scientist.
I love it.
That's Morgan. She's probably one of NASA's best spokespeople for exploring our solar system's icy moons.
Europa is a fascinating place. It has this liquid water ocean that's about 3 times the volume of all of Earth's oceans combined. That's a lot of water.
To understand what makes Earth so special, sometimes you need to back up and take in the big picture. Remember, the cryosphere is every place on Earth with frozen water. And water is one of the biggest indicators for life.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it.
And so far, Earth is the only planet we know of with life. Although Europa isn't the only icy moon in our solar system, NASA has identified it as one of those places with key astrobiological potential. Morgan is a collaborator on the Mapping Imaging Spectrometer for Europa, an instrument selected for NASA's next mission to Jupiter's icy moon Europa. But she's also more than just a scientist working in a laboratory. She's preparing future NASA missions for success on the surface of alien worlds. This year, Morgan and her colleagues were in the field studying how life colonizes in fresh lava.
Earth, it turns out, has a lot of excellent, what we call analog environments, places that are similar enough to some of these other worlds that we can conduct some tests and we can do some analyses here. Now, they're not perfect, of course. They're not going to be exactly like Europa, but we can still learn a lot by testing in these environments. Some of these places include Antarctica and the Arctic Circle, but there are other places too, Alaska, Greenland, even Iceland. Any place where you have a lot of ice, because guess what the surface of Europa is made of? A lot of ice.
Studying the cryosphere doesn't just have big implications for Earth. It also matters for the frozen worlds in our own cosmic backyard.
If we're able to find life or evidence of past life on a place like Europa, that tells us that not only can life happen in other places, but it's common enough that it happened at least twice in the same tiny solar system. That means that the universe is wide open in terms of how much life we might find, the types of life we might find. It would revolutionize how we see ourselves and the possibilities for contact in the universe. It would be amazing. Oh, it's so exciting.
As it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. So it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving. My interest in glaciers comes from the sheer size of these things and how much they're able to change on human timescales. And so the amount of mass and energy being transferred by glaciers around the globe is tremendous. It's an absolutely fascinating thing to study from space.
Mountain glaciers are some of the most charismatic parts of the cryosphere. Some might cling to the edges of cliffs at higher elevations, then lay bare and flat in a broad plain, looking cracked and weathered like elephant skin, before tumbling thousands of feet toward the sea and terminating in a dramatic calving front. They're like motion frozen in time, until they aren't. They tell a story about the distant past and yet are incredibly responsive to the present. You can understand why they'd be captivating to all of us, and especially cryospheric scientists. Meet Alex Gardner, a cryospheric scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who is going to help break down what a classic West Coast North American glacier might look like, where high amounts of snow dump onto the mountains.
And at higher elevations, there's melt in summer, but not enough melt to get rid of all of that snow. And so that snow accumulates, it compacts, it turns into ice, and it starts to flow under its own weight, and it flows down the valleys. And as it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. And so it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out and down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving.
Alex uses satellite data to study large-scale changes in glacial ice. But 2,000 miles to the north, Chris Larson from the University of Alaska Fairbanks spends a lot of time studying glaciers from the air. He's been flying over Alaskan mountain glaciers for many years, most recently on a NASA-funded mission called Operation Icebridge Alaska. He's absolutely enamored with his local rivers of ice.
And what do you love about mountain glaciers?
Well, they're in mountains, so they're really pretty.
You couldn't ask for a better way to experience Alaska on a large scale than to go flying around for campaign after campaign and look at all of the mountains in Alaska. Truly infinite. You just feel like you'll never see the end of them and don't want to either.
But Chris doesn't spend weeks away from home and family for the views. Chris and his colleagues at NASA want to answer some pretty big questions by learning more about Alaskan glaciers and how they tick.
You know, why does NASA care about these? Well, they actually disproportionately contribute a large amount to sea level rise.
In the long run, as the Earth warms due to climate change, the big ice sheets and mighty outlet glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica stand to contribute the most to sea level rise, simply because the vast majority of the planet's ice is stored there. But currently, it's the world's smaller mountain glaciers in comparatively warmer places like Alaska and Patagonia that are contributing about a third of all inputs to sea level rise, even though they account for only 1% of the world's ice.
Mostly due to them being dynamic. They have water at the bed, which allows them to slide fast, and they react quickly to climate change and have higher velocities than their polar counterparts.
Back at JPL, AKwx uses satellite measurements of global ice and computer models to predict ultimately how much sea level rise we might see due to climate change. But in the case of mountain glaciers, we also care about the local impacts of disappearing ice.
When we think of changes in ice sheets, we typically think of just what is the consequence for sea level rise and the future evolution of the ice sheets. But glaciers in other regions, like high mountain Asia, Alaska, the European Alps, these are places where changes in runoff matters to stream flows. In places like high mountain Asia, you have a lot of glaciers that feed the streams that flow down to populated regions. And that runoff becomes significant for water resources, irrigation, and agriculture.
Both Alex and Chris are passionate about understanding how glaciers are changing and what it means for our planet's future. They'll continue to use tools like elevation maps from the ICESat-2 satellite and detailed airborne measurements to monitor changing ice.
By the end of the tunnel, you're about 100 feet underground, and you're surrounded by bones sticking out of the wall from the steppe bison and the mastodons. There's sticks that are 40,000 years old. There's grass that's still green, that's tens of thousands of years old.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back. Looking at today's sea ice analysis. Of course, we got sea ice-free waters all the way up past the Cape Lisburne area and even a little bit farther to the north. And really not a lot changed from yesterday. Just looks like remnant ice left, not much at all on the north side of the Seward Peninsula there. But still pretty heavy there for the central and east side, and then it thins out over toward Kaktovik. And the trend over the next 4 or 5 days is no real big changes are expected. And for the coastal water forecast, along the coast, the Panhandle, west winds at 20 knots, seas 8 feet, northwest 10, 2-foot seas for Stevens Passage, Clarence Strait, southerlies at 10 for Stevens Passage, 20 knots south winds for Lynn Canal. And for Tuesday, Lynn Canal south again at 20 knots. Light winds continue for Stevens Passage, northwest 15 for Clarence Strait. Small craft advisories along and off the coast of Prince of Wales Island for northwest winds at 25 knots and 9-foot seas. Otherwise, the remainder of the coast, westerlies 15 to 20 knots with 8 to 9-foot seas. Cook Inlet, northern Cook Inlet, south winds 20 knots tomorrow, and small craft advisories for southern Cook Inlet for southwest winds at 25 knots. Kamishak Bay will see southwest winds at 15. The Barren Islands, western North Gulf Coast, westerlies 20 knots, 7-foot seas. Light west breeze, Prince William Sound, seas at 2 feet, and the eastern North Gulf Coast are forecasting winds out of the west at 15 knots. Those will pick up to 20 knots for the entire North Gulf Coast on Tuesday with 6 to 7-foot seas. Light winds continue in Prince William Sound. Light southwest breeze for Cook Inlet, and small craft advisories for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, both for westerly winds at 25 knots and 6 to 7-foot seas. Bristol Bay, as well as the Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula, southwest winds 25 knots for Monday with 6 to 8-foot seas, and from Cape Sarachev to Sitkinak, on the south side there, Pacific side, southwest winds at 20 knots with 8 to 10-foot seas, and stronger winds for Kodiak Island. Small craft advisories, especially Shelikof Strait, winds will be out of the southwest at 30 knots. And then for Tuesday, southwest winds 20 knots, both for Shelikof Strait and along the east side of Kodiak, all the way down to Castle Cape. Castle Cape to Cape Sarachev, south winds 20 knots. Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula, southwest 25, 5-foot seas. Southwest 15 to 4-foot seas in Bristol Bay. Fox Islands tomorrow on Alaska Islands, small craft advisory, southwest winds of 25 knots. Umak Island, southwest winds 20 knots. Adak and Atka, southwest at 20. And then gales moving into the far western Aleutians in the afternoon, southeast coming up to 35 knots. And then looks like gales front holds together well enough to produce even 40-knot gales in the forecast there for the Adak-Atka area. And then winds falling back to 30 knots out west, and then gales approaching the Umak Island area. Otherwise, the Fox Islands mostly south, 25 to 30 knots, 9 to 12-foot seas. Southwest coast, westerlies 15 to 20 knots. St. Matthew Island, small craft advisories. St. Lawrence Island, same thing, small craft advisories. Southwesterlies sustained at 25. Pribilofs west at 20. And for Tuesday, small craft advisories, all areas except Norton Sound. For the southwest coast, southerlies at 25 to 30 knots and 25 knot south wind St. Lawrence Island. 30 knot winds for the Pribilofs and St. Matthew Island with 12 to 15-foot seas. Up along the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, winds will be out of the east at 15 knots and then pick up to 20 knots on the central coast and move up to small craft advisories on the west side for sustained out of the east at 25, 4-foot seas. And from Cape Beaufort all the way down to Wales, winds will be southwest at 15. And then those will become small craft advisories on Tuesday as they turn southeast and increase to 25 knots. Otherwise, the Arctic coast looking pretty light wind-wise with west breeze at 10 knots and even lighter over toward demarcation point. And looking at tonight's forecast again, rain with that slow-moving front continues over the west, gradually pushing eastward while it tends to try to diminish. Rain moves into the Panhandle for a wet overnight period, becoming more showery tomorrow afternoon. Stays cloudy, cool, and wet over most of interior Alaska. There will be some drier areas with minimal sunshine, maybe Kodiak Island, one of them. Big storm comes in out west, brings the gale force winds into the central Aleutians with rain on Tuesday. Otherwise drier, especially over the southwest interior, with lingering showers in the southeast interior and wet and cool up north.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.